Hello, this is Dr. Benjamin Jones, and I'm going to give a very short lecture on the biodiversity of heterotrophic protists. There are three learning objectives for this lecture. The first learning objective is what are heterotrophic protists. The second learning objective is what are some of the basic body plans of these organisms. And the third learning objective is how do these organisms fit within the overall diversity of other organisms on this planet. The diagram on the left is an example of a phylogenetic tree which shows how groups of organisms relate to each other. Life first formed on Earth about 3 billion years ago. And we think that the earliest life forms was a type of bacteria. So bacteria have prokaryotic cells, so that means that they're quite simple. Prokaryotic cells normally just have one circular chromosome and very simple internal structures or organelles. They can multiply and divide very quickly as every 10 minutes. So from these very simple cells we have the formation of eukaryotic cells, and you can see this as well on this diagram on the right. So eukaryotic cells are more complex. They normally contain several strands of chromosomes and more complex internal structures and organelles. We term unicellular eukaryotic cells generally are termed protists. And then protists have helped give rise to higher level organisms such as animals, fungi and plants. These classification schemes are always changing, and because of the huge diversity of protists, attempts have been made to reclassify and narrow down what protists are. So kingdom Protista, they're all unicellular eukaryotes which lack collagen and chitinous cell walls, so they lack some of the structural components. They're generally non-photosynthetic in the primitive condition. So in this lecture we're talking about heterotrophic protists. So heterotrophs are animals which are consumers. They consume organic material for energy, and this compares to autotrophs, which are producers. So they fix energy from the sun to provide organic materials for the heterotrophs to consume. So kingdom Protista is generally thought of as a polyphyletic group. There's two different general classes of groups, as you can see on this diagram. So this purple box on the right is an example of a monophyletic group. So this D and E both share the same ancestral form, so they have a common ancestor. Meanwhile, with the polyphyletic group, you have B and C. They have different common ancestors. So the kingdom Protista is a very broad group which was originally comprised just because people didn't know where else to group these organisms. So everything that wasn't a plant, everything that wasn't an animal, a fungi or bacteria was grouped as a protist, although this definition has since narrowed down a little. So these groups of organisms, they may not necessarily share the same ancestral form, so they're called a polyphyletic group. So now we're going to talk about four of the basic body plans of heterotrophic protists. We're not going to talk about any of the algae or the giant kelp, which are autotrophic, so this will be excluded in this lecture. And many of these organisms, they've now been grouped into a separate kingdom called Chromista, although some people still consider this to be analogous with Protists, although many of these photosynthetic organisms, they're grouped in a separate kingdom now. So now we talk about the amoeba. So amoebas have a very unique form of locomotion. They don't have any specialized appendages involved in locomotion. What they do is that they move their cell to locomote any way which they choose. So it's quite an effective locomotor strategy. Here we have the cell membrane. Inside the cell we call the cytoplasm. So if they want to locomote this way, up, or if you can see my cursor, they just move their cell membrane and their cytoplasm moves to locomote any direction they choose. And they can also use this same strategy to engulf food, as you can see down here if you can see my cursor. So they've engulfed this food particle, and then they can engulf that within the cell, and then it gets digested. So we have an amoebic body plan. So that this belongs to phylum Rhizopoda. Another body plan, we can have a ciliated body plan. So this belongs to phylum Celophora. So we have lots of little cilia surrounding the outside of the cell, and they can beat in uniform to move the organism. So in this case this is a paramecium, and the cilia can also move the food such as organic material, bacteria, or maybe even other protists. They can move this food and funnel it down towards the gullet for it to be ingested. So the third body plan we can have a flagellated body plan. So this is another appendage that they can use for locomotion. It's a bit similar to the cilia, but they only have two. So they can have one cilia here around the mid part of the organism. There's a groove, and this can propel the dinoflagellate forward, and then they can have a long spiral cilia down the posterior end, which it can use to locomote in any direction which it may choose to go. So the fourth body plan, we have a phylum called Apicomplexa. These are all parasitic. So what we have is that they have a secondary host and a definitive host. The definitive host might be a person where the organism matures, and the intermediate stage might be in a mosquito. And then we have the gametes, which is the unfertilized egg or sperm, and then forming a zygote, which is like a fertilized egg, and then this forms a sporozoite, which might get infected into a person, and that further develops to form the adult stage called a merozoite, and then that produces further gametes which gets which infects the mosquito. So these don't have any locomotor apparatuses. They can't move at all, but they can infect a variety of hosts, and they can cause a lot of trouble. So just recapping what I've talked about 4 different types of body plans, and I've talked about some of the diversity of protists. So thank you for your time. Goodbye.